I am Elise Donovan, the Director of BVI House Asia. Today, BVI House Asia brings together some of the members of Team BVI Asia for a roundtable discussion on business in Asia, the opportunities and challenges. Team BVI Asia comprises a group of outstanding, experienced, and trusted practitioners doing business in Asia. They come from the world's leading corporate firms, trust companies, law firms, and others involved in the global financial services industry. They have helped their clients do business in Asia collectively for more than 25 years and are market experts when it comes to understanding the BVI and the business and personal wealth need of their clients in Asia and throughout the world. Some practitioners are based here in Hong Kong, some in Singapore, and others throughout the region. They are skilled at providing tailored, customized services to their clients across Asia to manage and preserve their globally diversified assets. Today, they discuss business in Asia, the opportunities and challenges.
Elise, I'm Robert Greaves from Hamilton Advisors. I'm moderating this panel today. We have with us members of Team BVI Asia. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Richard.
Thank you, Robert. My name is Richard Hall. I'm a partner with Conyers, Dillon Pearman, based here in Hong Kong. We advise on all offshore jurisdictions, including in particular the BVI. I have a particular focus myself on corporate work, and as a firm we cover a whole range of legal matters and topics that are relevant in the region.
Thank you. Alan?
Thanks, Robert. I'm Alan Collins. I'm an executive director of a firm called New Haven. We have offices in various offshore jurisdictions, including the BVI. I look after the Hong Kong operation, which deals with Hong Kong, China, and Far East Asia. We provide solutions for clients for corporate planning, trusts, and wealth management. And we have a particular focus on the BVI, where we have an office which is very busy and hopefully continues to be so.
Great. Jonathan?
Thanks, Robert. Jonathan Clifton from OL. I'm the Group Managing Director and part of the Vista Group. The Vista Group has roughly 1,400 people now. I'm based here in Hong Kong, and we do a lot of work with the BVI, ranging from simple incorporations to a range of corporate services through to some wealth planning and succession planning requirements.
Great, thank you. Paul?
Paul Christopher, Managing Partner for Hong Kong from around Ozans. We operate in a number of jurisdictions in Hong Kong. 50% of the work that we do is BVI related, covering funds, corporate, finance, litigation, and international trust and private client.
Thank you, Paul.
John Rogers, I'm the Managing Partner of Walkers in Singapore. We have offices here in Hong Kong and in Singapore. We have a large focus on BVI with an office there ourselves. Like my colleagues, we focus on finance, corporate and funds. And we have about 45 lawyers in Asia.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to start address the first question to Jonathan, if I may. Offshore financial centers have been described variously as the plumbing of the global financial services industry. Jonathan, can you just tell us a little bit more? How does this work, and how does it work in such things as cross-border trade?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting analogy, the concept of the plumbing or the wiring of the global economic system. And I think it's one that's been gaining traction over the past few years, because if you think about the concept of globalization, that's something that's well known to many people and has been in the kind of the vocabulary of sort of modern economics for the past 30 or 40 years. But what isn't so well known is the role that the offshore centres or the offshore industry plays in actually enabling globalization. So if you think about it, anything that involves a cross-border activity, be it one organisation buying another organisation, whether it's a JV investing into a new country, whether it's setting up a factory and facilitating capital flow, all of this requires a system to enable it. And the plumbing analogy that we use is to describe what these entities or structures actually enable. It enables the cross-border capital flow that we see. And, often it's the banks, the financial institutions that people are well versed in terms of their role that these guys play. But it's important to be able to articulate the role that the offshore centres play. So again, I guess anything that involves cross-border activity, cross-border transactions, that's why we would describe, we'll use the analogy as the plumbing of the system.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So in 2015, what is the trend? Is it becoming more important? Are these structures becoming more important, less important? What would you see as the major trend line?
Yeah, well, I think you go to what's happening at a macro level. You know, do you believe in the fact that globalization will continue? Do you believe that companies and countries will continue to operate outside of their own borders and jurisdiction? And for me, the answer is yes. So if you believe in globalization, then what we see, certainly from our perspective, is an increase in demand for the underlying entities, whether it's for holding assets, whether it's for facilitating capital flow, whether it's for raising capital or debt, all of that sort of plays a part in globalization. So certainly our view and our sense is that you're seeing a continued growth in the demand, the underlying demand for these structures. That there's multiple sources for why clients may choose to set up a structure, but as a whole, at a macro level, I think we're seeing very consistent growth across the whole industry.
Great. If we drill down into Asia, since we are in Hong Kong, if you look around the region, can you pinpoint where the demand is strongest or where it's coming from?
Yeah, I think the obvious country for the past 15, 20 years is China. China has been a significant originator of business for the past two decades or so. But again, it's not a purely China market. I think there are a number of countries across Southeast Asia that are really starting to see an increase in demand. So places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, we're all sort of seeing growth in these markets. But Hong Kong originated business, Singapore originated business, Taiwanese originated business. All of these countries have different reasons for demand, but again, at a macro level and an underlying demand level, volumes are seen to be growing. Fantastic.
Is there anything you'd like to add? Is there anything that I'm missing here in my questioning that you'd like to tell me about?
I think I'd probably use the analogy of a five-star hotel. So people might look at a five-star hotel and see all the beautiful rooms and appliances and pools, but if the plumbing doesn't work, if the wiring isn't there, then the whole thing falls apart. So again, that's there's a lot of perceptions about the role the industry plays, and often it's linked to negative perceptions. But I think part of the benefits of bringing people like this group together is to try and put forward an alternate view to be able to explain that it's not all about sort of tax dodging.
Coming back to you, Jonathan, it must be English common law backs all of this, and that must be very important. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if we're talking China and the role that BVI and other jurisdictions have played, part of the underlying reason for that is the professional independent infrastructure that the BVI can provide. That gives a lot of confidence or surety to investors into countries such as China. But it's obviously not just China. I think across Asia, different countries, different economies are at different stages of their own evolution. So being able to utilise or effectively outsource in many ways their legal infrastructure to jurisdictions such as the BVI, which is well known, it's sound-worthy, it's trustful, it's robust, all of that plays a part in terms of the demand for these structures.
And it's a globalized, certain legal structure, which helps a great deal, I would imagine.
Absolutely, I think.
Yeah, I can add in there. I mean, the way it's a slightly hackneyed phrase, but business thrives on certainty, and I think our view is that certainly the BVI, with that underpinning of English common law, and obviously with a serious court now in the BVI, and an infrastructure around that, provides the legal certainty. And therefore, when you have that certainty, that actually reduces costs, for example, going forward. People can price in the fact that there is that certainty that may not be there otherwise, is our experience, particularly in areas like financing, just generally structuring a deal.
Great, thank you
I
very
can
much.
perhaps just leap in there as
Yes.
as the only non-practicing lawyer in this group. One of the things that we find is particularly advantageous about BVI as a jurisdiction is, as mentioned, the depth of support that there is here and understanding of the BVI legal system, the availability of seasoned and highly skilled professionals can deal with the legal aspects and the financial aspects as well.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
It's interesting that, you mentioned plumbing of the international finance world. I guess the trust structure and availability of that type of structuring in the BVI is the electricity circuits of the private wealth management
well
business,
said.
I think. So that's another aspect, I think, which we'll be happy to discuss a bit later on, perhaps.
Excellent. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to leave it there, that topic for the moment. I want to turn to John. And I want you, John, if you would please, let's just focus down on Asia and just remind us, what do we need to be mindful of when we're doing business in Asia?
Yeah, it's a few things. I mean, for us, the key is relationships. We've been fortunate enough to be here quite a long time, and for me personally, 15 years. You learn the region as you go along, and the regional diversity is quite important. I think we can all get bogged down in the PRC initially. It's the big elephant to go after, but having worked the region and travelled the region, you do see that diversity in play. And building relationships in each place and trying to understand, as Jonathan touched upon, the demands of each country may be different. We sell a similar thing in the BVI, but adapting it and making it relevant is quite an important function that we see with the lawyers and for the service providers like OIL. Taking the time to understand each country is quite important. BVI has a luxury that it has momentum. The 25 years of momentum of being used heavily in the region helps. It opens doors, it has a high level of awareness. But part of our job is to navigate through where it's not being used quite so much and make it relevant. The rule of law thing is very key for us, that the lack of certainty around enforcing a share mortgage or a building mortgage in the PRC is relevant. That means that the foreign banks we act for, and we have Material Banking and Finance Group, they are looking to lend money to get the mobilisation point right and get the cash flows across borders, but they want to have some certainty as to the rule of law. Our job is to get to know the local law sufficiently well to intertwine ourselves in it and then sell something combined with the other lawyers in the region. So it's not just the underlying clients we get to know, we actually try and get to know the lawyers in each country, whether it be tax lawyers locally or whether it be finance or corporate or otherwise, trying to make ourselves relevant and therefore the BVI product relevant. And that takes time. That's a relationship building exercise. There's also a relevance too to the family wealth / corporate grey area in Asia, with so much of the large corporates actually being underlying families. Each country has a certain number of dominant families behind it. That allows a lot of BVI products to come into play. There can be the trust planning for the founder and the succession planning for his children who may go to school in the UK now. There might be a listing element for Richard and his business in terms of the listing side. If you can develop those companies and their subsidiaries up to a sufficient level, we put debt in, they take them private. Navigating through that, the private and the corporate side of the region is very important. Being based in Singapore, we've deliberately gone there strategically 6 years ago with a focus on ASEAN, recognising that there was a number of smaller demand countries south of here that needed to be better understood. ASEAN bloc is on target for some sort of material event late this year. How that impacts on our business is yet to be seen, but if that's anything like a regional cooperative group that will encourage cross-border cash flows, that plays well into something that BVI can be part of, and it's something that we monitor fairly closely. And we are seeing more demand from some of those more peripheral countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, as Jonathan talked about. But again, that's a very time-consuming investment on the relationship side rather than necessarily going after the more well-beaten paths of Hong Kong and China.
So it really is personal, it's building relationships, and it's also a process of education, isn't it?
Yeah, on both sides though, we have to educate ourselves a little bit about why each country is different, and there may be different tax drivers and different tax rules at play, and we have to be very mindful of local law change. So a lot of the focus around BVI at the moment is threats, but the threats can come very locally. So there's been changes to stamp duty law in Hong Kong and Singapore in the last 5 years. Holding companies to buy an apartment in Hong Kong and Singapore have been a big demand driver. Both governments wanted to slow down and cool their housing market, so they introduced stamp duty. The things like this we have to be aware of and not just get focused on the BVI side, but actually look at the other side of the equation to make sure we're staying relevant.
So, John, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I am going to put you on the spot a little bit. You were talking about ASEAN as a sort of monolithic group here, or a big group. So where would you see the keenest opportunity in some of these smaller countries you were just mentioning?
Well, again, I think the challenge for those countries to be part of a successful ASEAN is that the very family-oriented domestic dominance doesn't lend itself very well to an ASEAN flow. So the governments on the one hand want to see more cross-border interaction, but there will be a bias back to some of the older families doing well domestically. But we already see some of those families, whether it be Thailand or the Philippines, setting up investment, almost private equity family offices in Singapore, looking for family balance sheet investments throughout the region outside of their home patch. They will use offshore companies to put that together. So it's actually getting to know their ambition outside of their own shore. And I think ASEAN lends to that they will look for, and they'll look for rule of law. The Singaporeans are looking to sell rule of law certainty out of Singapore Arbitration Centre. BVI has strong rule of law. We see opportunities potentially for BVI law to be used for arbitration in Singapore. So we've done some work with the Arbitration Centre and the Mediation Centre in Singapore, trying to make sure that our lawyers could be relevant to the seat of arbitration being in Singapore. So again, trying to tie the laws of the region to us and trying to get the cash flows monitored and then flow the works with that.
So would you ever use the arbitration center in Hong Kong, or you focus mostly on ASEAN right now?
It's not really our call. The clients will decide where they seat. We have some degree of visibility into increased use of Singapore. That may or may not have something to do with Hong Kong and Chinese relations. So you can see some of the documents that we work on now are picking Singapore as a seat of arbitration, but the governing law may still be BVI. So we have to be aware of that not everyone wants to necessarily go to the BVI to have their litigation or their arbitration, and Singaporeans are trying to promote it being done in Singapore. Our job is to make sure that BVI law can try and stay relevant in that. And we try and navigate that through the documents we work on.
Well, we're going to get into a little bit more about succession planning, wealth succession, asset protection a little later, but just on this family office thing, it just seems to be growing exponentially. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Singapore's had a pretty windfall gain over the last 5 or 6 years, I would say. Whether it be Russian money, whether it be Swiss bank accounts being less favoured, there's a lot playing into the Singapore opportunity. Part of the challenge for BVI is to make sure that our companies are being used in that new demand, and not just Singapore companies. But yes, it's very real. The private trust planning part for these guys, I think we've seen a certain amount of that. That's taking more time than certainly we anticipated. Partly there's a fee issue there that compared to Europe, where Jersey Trust, for example, would have been historically used and paid for by Jersey clients, Asian clients are not quite yet ready in some respects to pay for heavy trust planning. But as the founders are ageing and their demands for succession planning are rising, we do see a move towards that. But a lot of the private wealth for us at the moment, if I'm honest, is private banking and banks trying to lend into these family offices and these family structures. So our banking and finance business is to some extent successful off the back of banks having interface with their private wealth clients.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Before we leave this topic, gentlemen, any additional thoughts? Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking about some of the characteristics that are unique to Asia, particularly from, say, a buying behaviour, two of the things that we see quite a lot in our business is this focus on speed. So how quickly can you turn around an order or a request, and price. Now, I think you've got to sort of, if you were to compare Asia to generally a Western European market or North American market, those two things are unique in Asia. So the question around price and value is an interesting one, and I think the BVI has done a very, very sound job at pricing its services at the right level. It's not the cheapest, it's not the most expensive, but it matches the market very well. So I guess part of the strategic question is, as the market evolves, as the market becomes more sophisticated, what should the BVI do around pricing? But I think certainly over the past 2 decades, speed and price has been spot on for the market. And for example, a lot of the stuff that BVI Asia House is doing plays to this notion of quicker turnaround time. Other jurisdictions haven't invested in this type of infrastructure. So again, it reinforces the view that the BVI is a jurisdiction that's focused on the market and will turn around things quickly, or more quicker than others.
Great.
As someone who's in the same business as Jonathan, although in a much smaller way, of course, I have to echo what he says, and the availability of so many service providers in Hong Kong that are well experienced and capable of dealing with BVI matters, I think is really great for the BVI and also for the public, because it drives a very high level of quality whilst keeping prices extremely competitive. I have to add one of the great things that has occurred out of BVI House Asia is, we guys who are all rivals in the business are sitting around the table together now in these sort of situations, working for the common good of our industry and the BVI, and that's really been a very, very positive development, I think, which never happened in the 25 years of history of providing BVI services in this part of the world. So, I think we're really maturing and moving along in that respect.
Well, it's great to hear that BVI is bringing people together. I like that. That's a good
It's
message.
a very friendly place. Yeah.
I will give it, Paul, do you have anything to add? You all right?
No, I mean, just to echo those points, I mean, it is phenomenally competitive on the ground here. The timing is sometimes very, very difficult.
There's a certain impatience, isn't there? There's a certain, let's get it done now. Right?
Yes, yeah. I wouldn't want to say more than that. on
Yes,
camera.
right.
I would just add one thing. I think that the BVI infrastructure, though, we mustn't ever lose sight of, that what we do in our daylight hours, if we can do it that quickly, it is so dependent on overnight turnaround. So we might be the coal face and the responsiveness is key, but for all of our businesses, I can certainly speak for ours and I speak for yours too, the infrastructure of government, the infrastructure of our own people in the BVI, critical mass, delivering on what we promise we will do overnight, mustn't be understated. So there is a trade-off between employment here and employment in the BVI, which we're all mindful of, but the two must coexist to my mind, because without the sales force out here representing and being available and responsive, the product won't sell as well, but equally it won't be delivered as well if we don't have the wonderful infrastructure we have back at base.
Right. Thank you all very much. I'd like to turn to a third topic, and I'd like to address this to Richard, if I may, and that's how offshore finance is specifically working in Asia, and what is it accomplishing, and how does it work, Richard?
Thank you, Rob. I think, echoing a lot of what the other panelists already said, it operates on many different levels. We're also seeing a change and an increased use in more complex structures. It is something that John was talking about earlier. I think as the different people talk about Asia as a homogeneous whole, but actually there are quite disparate areas, and as Hong Kong has been using it for 30, 40 years. And as a result, lots of the local lawyers are very familiar with how it works, they're very comfortable with how it works, they are more than willing to use it within their structures. They've worked with law firms here for 25, almost 30 years in some cases, and so they're very familiar with the product. They also are delighted that the product moves with the times. We had the new Business Companies Act in 2004, which, I mean, I know we're all somewhat biased, but at the time you'd have to say it was probably the best piece of corporate legislation that was out there. And a number of the things that EUI did in 2004, Hong Kong finally did to its own legislation last year, so that's a 10-year head start. And so it's used in many different ways in many different areas, but certainly we see it at all levels, across all structures, from simple holding company structures. You know, Jonathan will deal with lots of these people. Someone wants to buy a house in Hong Kong, they want to put it through a BVI holding company, it's easy for them. Used to have a stamp duty benefit, now not so much. People will be using trusts at the wealth management level. And again, I agree that in that case it's a more difficult market. The willingness to pay for bespoke trust structuring advice is limited here, but I think that applies. I don't think that's a BVI specific problem. I think that would apply across any offshore jurisdiction. There is a general unwillingness till you get to a very high level of wealth to pay for that specialist bespoke structure. And some of that I think is because a lot of the inheritance rules, particularly in Hong Kong, are so simple. You know, there are very few taxes that you really need to look at. And lots of the private wealth banks will pretty much give you your bespoke package off the bat. You know, you sign up for your $5 million US account, and they give you a trust structure on their standard planning. So the ability to add value there is often can be limited. We see funds, guys using BVI fund structures here. We see, as John said, lots of joint venture arrangements. People are very comfortable using BVI joint venture companies. They like, as Paul said, they like the rule of law, they like the availability of suitable professionals to help them drive their structures, who know what they're doing, quick turnaround. They're much more comfortable investing into the PRC or Vietnam or Malaysia or wherever it is through a BVI company where they know if there is a dispute, they can end up in Singapore arbitration, or they can end up in court in the BVI with a determined rule of law rather than something that they deem as maybe not quite as transparent or quite as certain. People are willing to pay, I think, for that certainty of structure. And then within those general corporate spheres, I think we see BVI companies doing everything. Lots of, John will do lots of SPV debt issuer companies, so lots of listed companies will be using BVI SPVs to issue bonds and notes. They're listed in Singapore in particular, flowing the proceeds back through the ListCo. We're using them for estate planning purposes. We're using them particularly for subsidiary and holding company structures through IPOs and general corporates. Across Asia, they work at all levels for all purposes, and that they're a great product and a great structure to use.
Well, that's a great summary. It sounds like there's more diversity and complexity in these financings these days.
I think that's right. I think that certainly, and again, it moves around between markets as economies grow and develop and mature, and people are more prepared to look at more complex structures. You go from very simple bank loans, debt issuances, into more hybrid structures. People who are more willing to use the companies in a more creative way because they can see the benefit that flows to them. And I think that as you get that groundswell of experience and the professionals to back it up, which you certainly have around Asia, both on the legal, the administrative and the banking side, people are more willing to listen to that level of advice because they can see the benefits to their business.
Are the transactions, the financing is getting larger at all, or is it not necessarily?
Some are big, some small. I mean, we see some very large note issuances, some very large bond deals. We had very first issuance, for example, China State Grid up in the PRC, which is the world's 6th largest company by capitalization. They used a BVI company as their SPV when they went to their first bond issue to the market. I think that was somewhere in the region of $2 billion US. So very large debt issues can be run through what are, very simple $1 one share holding companies.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the renminbi, the Chinese yuan. Are there more financings being done in that currency?
I think that will come with time. I think it will be interesting to see what happens with the ASEAN issues that John was referring to, what happens with the Asian Investment Bank when it gets up and running, whether that's used as a currency of a convertible tradable currency and settlement currency. If so, then I think there will be more drive towards that. It ebbs and flows, and things come in and out of favour. We had a big push with the Hong Kong Stock Exchange 18 months ago to have dual currency listed companies because they were very much in favour of pushing the currency and being seen to facilitate trade in it. It seems to have kind of drifted sideways a bit. I'm not sure that businesses have been really persuaded of the upside to their own business of doing a dual traded structure. But I think a lot of it will depend on the central banks and how much they facilitate the free flow of currency. And the more that it frees up, I think the more you will see people prepared to issue.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Anything to add, John?
Yeah, I just had a couple of things. I think
John?
that 15 years ago, the more complicated cross-border structures didn't tend to use BVI. But for debt issuance and for equity, there were other offshore jurisdictions that had a lead in that more sophisticated environment. Part of that was the availability of service providers. So a lot of law firms like ours had more lawyers in other jurisdictions, to be fair. BVI has had an influx over the last 15 years, both domestically and abroad, of more cross-border lawyers into the industry, along with investment from John's firm and others. So that, I think, has led to the usage has gone broader. So whereas it was volume, hold an apartment, holding company type work, and that's very important for volumes for the government, the more sophisticated use required the lawyers to catch up. And so dim sum bonds, to connect your two conversations, is not a bad place to start. That to see BVI companies being used to issue RMB bonds in the Hong Kong market, if they'd been around 10 years ago, that probably would have been a different offshore jurisdiction. So there's more comfort around BVI to do a more sophisticated, larger market type trade rather than a smaller sort of private type trade. On the dim sum point, the RMB bonds, liquidity has been the issue. That there's been sporadic demand that we've seen, but it blows a bit hot and cold around low interest rates on US dollars and availability or liquidity of the RMB. So we think it's here to stay, and there is some track record in a relatively small market of BVI being used. So that's positive.
Excellent.
Yeah, just one other point around specifically from an Asian perspective. We've seen a real growth in demand for asset protection purposes, particularly around intellectual property. And if you look at the growth in IP registrations or trademark registrations in countries such as China, Japan and Korea, those three countries now occupy 3 out of the top 5 spots globally. And so typically Japan and Korea, if they were to invest cross-border, they would have done so directly. Japanese company directly investing into a third country. But there's some interesting developments in terms of there's some new markets opening up in terms of use of BVI companies, specifically for holding IP as asset protection. So again, I think there's kind of a theme here where it's a little bit of sort of horses for courses, and across the region there's diverse demand and diverse solutions.
Since you have opened up the topic of asset protection, I will ask Alan if there's anything you'd like to add to what Jonathan was just saying.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I'd like to say a few things about asset protection, also about succession planning, which are both quite hot topics for BVI at the moment. In fact, I'm glad that Jonathan clarified that for asset protection, we're not always talking about protecting the assets of surgeons from negligence, which has been the traditional view people have taken of asset protection, of course, and that is one view of asset protection, but it's not one that the BVI has ever been actively involved in. It's never been a jurisdiction that has sold that type of asset protection trust. I'd like to also thank Richard for indicating the difficulty of getting clients to pay for bespoke trust advice. I'm going to remind of that next time we seek advice and try and keep these things down. But it is interesting that it's not just the fees and the cost of the advice, which has been something of an inhibitor, I suppose, to trust structures in particular for succession planning and asset protection. But also the reluctance, not only in this part of the world, but every part of the world, I suppose, to go through that ultimate step of divesting oneself of hard-earned assets into the hands of a trustee somewhere in some far-flung jurisdiction. But I think there's an increasing sophistication in this part of the world, in Hong Kong, and I think increasingly in China, understanding the benefits for succession planning of using trusts, asset protection in the best possible sense of the word in terms of preserving family wealth for future generations and ensuring that it's managed effectively and properly going forward. And that's an area which I think the BVI has become increasingly successful in providing those sorts of those services. The past 25 years, BVI has been a jurisdiction where the BVI companies, of course, have been the gold standard in terms of offshore corporate structures. And that, in a way, I suppose, has created a situation which people are now starting to become aware of, which is that there are many hundreds of thousands of BVI companies in the hands of individuals or perhaps in the hands of nominee shareholders with aging beneficial owners or aging shareholders who are now facing the prospect of providing for orderly succession of those assets in BVI companies. And I think that provides a very real opportunity for BVI planning in terms of the very flexible trust structures that are available. Vista Trust, which is a very popular vehicle for providing a kind of Rolls-Royce of nominee arrangements, I suppose is one way to describe it. The very flexible and innovative approach to private trust companies, and BVI have remained very light on their feet in terms of developing the private trust company, which is a very popular vehicle, of course, for family offices, which we mentioned beforehand. So I think, in that respect, BVI is doing a very good job of moving beyond this perception in many quarters of being purely a corporate jurisdiction and being a jurisdiction where there is a very wide range of financial and structuring opportunities available.
Thank you very much for that. Paul, let me turn to you on the same topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see the BVI as being heavily used over the years for wealth planning in Asia, as very well recognised in Asia. Of course, it is also, unlike, for example, here in Hong Kong, a lot of the services that are provided, the trusteeships, directorships, these sorts of things are regulated in BVI. So that, it's quite an important feature and something to remember. I would echo that there is this reluctance somewhat to pay for the structuring advice. In our experience, that's right up until the point that families had a very bad experience previously, and then they're actually at that point. They understand the value of the advice that can be given, and the fact that having all your assets in the structure, it's actually very important to get the advice right and take very, very specialist advice on it. I think there's been some recent, Asia has its own unique challenges around wealth and succession planning. I think that's probably highlighted by a recent report that's suggesting amongst the very wealthy Asian families, something like 91% foresee their business continuing into the future, i.e. they're not looking, when they're looking to plan for a succession, they're not looking to divest that business and turn it into some form of bankable assets.
So they're looking to wind down.
They're looking for continuity. They're looking to create an institution going into the future.
Interesting.
And I think the BVI is well placed with trusts like the Vista Trust, very well placed with private trust companies as well, and the levels of control that they provide to the patriarchs and settlors. So I think it stands, its experience of having worked in the wealth structuring side of things in the past is good news.
Well, I like your thought that many of these families have tried the rest, and they come to the BVI and they try the best. So that's very good. I like that. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to, in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to a general group discussion. I have a couple of themes here I'd like to run through, where I'm going to open it up really to all of you rather than taking you in turn. So my first question is regarding the BVI in Asia, the outlook, the opportunities and challenges. We've talked about the demands above, but let's talk about the environment here in Asia. For example, let's talk about regulation. Are there any regulatory frameworks, anything we should be talking about, challenges, opportunities, that sort of thing? Who would like to? Yes, John.
I wasn't volunteering. Yeah, look, I think we've been relatively fortunate for a long time that some of the regulatory environments in Asia have been less focused on BVI than some of the European and US markets might have been. That said, I think the fact that we're BVI is ahead of the curve on AML is very important. We were invited last week to the Singaporean Law Society is looking at new regulation for the lawyers there, and there's a whole draft set of rules to apply to the lawyers and lawyers taking on new clients and AML, and it was with some relief and some pride we were able to bat straight back and say, well, this is what BVI's had for years. So it's a very real and current example of where we have to sell the story, but we don't have to be defensive about it. We actually have very good AML. To the BVI's credit, I think we have to be mindful of external pressures. I don't think publicly available register of members pressures out here in Asia are as strong as they are with Mr Cameron in the UK, for example. We will be having to deal with that if changes are brought as a result of regulatory pressure in the US or in the UK and they become universally applied within the BVI. Our challenge will be to navigate that in Asia. They may not be generated by Asia, those changes, but they'll be consequential, if you like. So we don't see huge amounts of regional pressure to change the way BVI operates. Contrast some of our other regions that we operate in. There is some pressure, but not the same level of materiality you would apply to the UK or to the US. But we have to be mindful of how we would and deliver our services in an environment where they may change. So, we monitor the regulation fairly closely.
Richard,
I was
yes.
very much going to agree with a lot of what John has to say there. I think that it's not an Asian-driven process. I think much of the headwinds that confront the industry are generally European-driven. I think a lot of it is this idea of the beneficial ownership register, which just seems a political football that's convenient to kick. It seems unworkable in practice, and how you would ever have a beneficial ownership register of a trust company that ran, for example, an employee share scheme or anything of that nature where options hadn't vested. How would you possibly determine who the beneficial owner of these assets were? If you have a BVI company holding an NPF, for example, how would you possibly get behind beneficial owners of these entities? That's what trust is there for. The fact that the entire industry is so well regulated and has been for so many years in the BVI, with all of your service providers being subject to strict regulation, anti-money laundering, and the know your client checks, which I know will cause us all those conversations with our Hong Kong and Singaporean counsel who are shouting as to why on earth you haven't managed to get the deal done in less than 24 hours, and you're pointing out that you need a photocopy of the man's passport before you can clear these checks. But I think they stand the industry in good stead. I think it can show that we are a clean house and have been in order for a very long time.
But doesn't it, as a general, I'm just going to throw this statement out, with all of this regulation going on, doesn't it create sort of a level playing field around the world? Doesn't it hit all jurisdictions just about the same? And so then some of the other things you're talking about that the BVI can do comes into play as a selling point, as it were. Would you agree with that, Jonathan?
I think it depends. I think we're talking sort of regulations at a macro level. I think it is heading towards an even playing field. But if we sort of head down the path where certain jurisdictions, and let's take the BVI, and this comment's more relevant to service providers rather than the law firms. But the question of the eligible introducer regime is a hot topic at the moment. A lot of discussion, a lot of dialogue, a lot of debate around what's the best way forward. I think Alan and I would share a similar view here that we need to be very careful around what we do with this regime. It's been the backbone of driving, the real sort of volumes of growth that we've seen in Asia. So that's where we have the potential around some jurisdictional arbitrage. If the BVI would go down the path of discontinuing the regime and other jurisdictions were to continue that, then I think there's some issues that will create. But I think at a macro level around AML and KYC, that is a level playing field. But when we start talking, jurisdictional specific implementation, then I think there's not necessarily a level playing field.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd echo that, Jonathan. I mean, I think, in the past there's been what one might describe as a flight to the bottom, where people have been going to jurisdictions which have had sort of lower regulation and perhaps lower cost, but the increased level of global regulation, I think, is now creating a situation where there's a flight to quality. And generally speaking, the service providers are improving their quality, and the product, as a result, improves the quality. And I think it's the good of the industry, really. One of the impacts, I suppose, that the whole offshore industry is experiencing in Hong Kong and other places is an indirect form of regulation, really, which is the regulation of the banks, which, because of the stringent KYC and other issues that they have, it becomes more difficult for offshore companies and indeed onshore companies in Hong Kong to deal with banks. But again, I think that just really provides a higher level of quality in service and in the industry as a whole.
Well, if I could just jump in, I think that point is absolutely spot on. We've seen over the course of the last 18 months until about 3 to 6 months ago a tendency for clients who would normally have gone straight to a BVI as their preferred jurisdiction of choice have chosen other, what we personally consider to be slightly weaker jurisdictions. And the net result has been that after about a year of that, people have discovered that the second they want anything done, they want their legal opinion written, they want some advice, they want share registers written up. There simply isn't the infrastructure that John was talking about and the support in Asia and within the home jurisdiction to enable that to be done on any sort of a timeline that they're anticipating. And they're quite used in Asia to being able to pick up the phone and speak to Alan and Jonathan and get a company delivered to their desk that afternoon, to be able to speak to the lawyers around the table and get legal opinions written overnight, to have documentation filed with regulators within 24 hours, and the whole transaction to be done very seamlessly and very smoothly. And as a result of that move to other jurisdictions, we've seen people come moving back, and almost you almost want to make them apologise for their foolishness, but you realise that you need to build.
You're just charging them all now.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is the BVI government. It's clearly demonstrated it wants to be a good world citizen. It's keen to engage with regulators from other jurisdictions and supranational bodies and to be reviewed and so on and so forth. And I just think the way that the offshore industry is going, the ability to deploy capital in and out of jurisdictions going forward, and the barriers that are likely to be used politically in doing that, is very important to have a government that is focused on maintaining those relationships.
good point.
I think one point that needs to be mentioned is, for many years in Hong Kong we've had personal data privacy protection legislation, but the provisions regarding transfer of personal data outside of Hong Kong have never been enacted for various political reasons. There is now a suggestion that those provisions will be brought into force, which will obviously have very significant ramifications for everybody who's transferring personal data from Hong Kong to other jurisdictions. So this is something that I think in the future will necessarily need to be the subject of some attention, both from the industry and from the BVI government.
Interesting. I want to just move, we have a number of questions here, but I just want to move a little bit to what makes an offshore jurisdiction competitive. I think you've been talking around it, but I wonder if one of you would like to sum up, in your opinion, what do you think the characteristics are? Maybe you've mentioned it already. Maybe it's the rule of law backing it up. Maybe it's the versatility. Maybe it's its ability to finance in various situations. And perhaps we've summed that up already, which would bring three letters to mind that I know of. But you would all agree with that, I think.
Yeah, it's branding.
Yes.
BVI has an excellent brand and has had many years. And those who have been in business for a long time know many jurisdictions who have come with one gimmick or another, that they've tried to make serious inroads into BVI's market share. And it's never been successful because people know BVI, they know the level of support, they know the strength of the infrastructure, and it's a very strong brand. And it's axiomatic in Hong Kong. Everybody refers to offshore companies as BVIs, regardless of the jurisdiction they're from.
Right.
BVI is a generic term for an offshore company in this part of the world. The brand is that strongly entrenched.
One thing you mentioned, which is not really probably answering your question, but language skills. The industry here is, because of the investment that the government has made and the firms have made, having that language capability shouldn't be lost, I guess, in today's Asian focus. It's probably my fault, that was my question. But yeah, I think that's a part of it. And the BVI government having PRC characters on the name was a small thing, but it's a very clever thing, and some of these small changes that come through industry consultation are quite important. So not every jurisdiction, when you go back to depth of talent and provision of services, will have the language capability. We run a Cantonese hot desk for one of our banks. We have 2 or 3 lawyers who can speak and are available 24 hours a day to speak Cantonese. That sort of thing actually goes a long way to driving volume. So that's part of it. I think, to answer your original question, tax can be a factor in all this. Not having a tax system, zero tax is important. But equally, it goes back to one other point, just quickly. That's not always relevant. So some countries, some clients may need a double tax treaty. So part of our job, as I said earlier, is navigating. There'll be certain deals that won't be relevant because of the zero tax. They're actually looking for a double tax treaty network, and that will play into form another country, another offshore jurisdiction like a Mauritius or a Seychelles, because the demand is actually looking for a different product. And that's back to the point about trying to understand what we're selling and what people are trying to buy, and match up that supply and demand, because it won't always be that our offshore elements are what are required by the deal.
Well, that's a very good point. I want to stay with you on something like that. I want to go into something a little different. So in China, there's now low fertility, and the population looks like it's going to be slowing down. How do these various demographic factors, does that figure into how the BVI is going to be used or continue over time? And also, I'll just kick in, there are different inheritance tax rules and different objectives from these families, so how do you arbitrage all of this?
I might go back to the earlier answer about trust planning and this plan.
Yeah, maybe sort of China from a more macro perspective to start with. I mean, I think the industry, particularly the BVI, if you're looking to put some bets on the table, China is clearly one of them. I think one of the key trends that we've all seen over the past few years is this swing towards outbound investment. So it was only the last couple of years that the amount of capital flowing from China to the rest of the world exceeded the amount of capital coming into China. Now that's important for two reasons, because the BVI and Cayman are still the number one and number two offshore jurisdictions to facilitate flow from China to the rest of the world. So that's the first point. The second point is, obviously, as the RMB continues its liberalisation, timing who knows, and there's also the fact that there's a central government policy to promote outbound Chinese investment. So you triangulate those three sort of data points and you can see continued growth of Chinese investment going into the world. You look to what's the plumbing that enables that. Again, it's BVI and other sort of top-end offshore jurisdictions. So I wouldn't see there's a whole, we talk about China as one country, but there will be booms and busts in China, I think, over the next few years, but in totality or on balance, I think China is going to continue to be a major sort of source of growth for the industry.
Excellent.
I think this is a classic example as well of success feeding success. We've had 10, 20 years predominantly inbound, where Chinese entrepreneurs in particular have become very familiar, very comfortable with BVI structures. They may well have had some private equity money into their BVI holding companies. They've been very comfortable with how it all works. They like the lawyers they work with, they like the legislation, they like the flexibility, they like the fact, as John says, that the government is prepared to change things. They can have Chinese names in their certificates of incorporation, they can even have transliterations rather than direct translation, so that there can be the cultural sensitivities to the use of the lucky sounding name that isn't a direct translation so we can understand it. But because of that 20 years of people becoming familiar with BVI in that direction, when they turn to start sending the money back out, they've been more than happy and very comfortable with using it in the other way around. And I think that the success of the money coming in and the people working on building that familiarity has then enabled the Chinese entrepreneurs that are looking to take the money out to use them as almost the default. Unless, as John says, there's a tax driver for somewhere else and going to India through Mauritius, the BVI is one of the default companies to go to for the money coming out because of those familiarity reasons.
Right. Thank you on that. The final point I'd like to ask each of you, or collectively or individually, is if you could look beyond the current horizon and prognosticate a bit on the prospects for growth for the BVI in Asia over the next 5 to 10 years. So what are the key areas to invest in and focus on? Have we answered that?
Shall I take that one?
You go first, mate.
This is where we give all away our firm's plans for the extended 15 years.
I've got my broker on speed dial, so don't worry.
I think in terms of growth, I think that we'll see a greater use of BVI companies for listing vehicles. They've already been accepted onto the exchange. There have been 2 or 3 successes. Other jurisdictions are still very much the default go-to jurisdictions, but I think BVI will become more accepted, and as that momentum builds, then people will become more familiar with them. In terms of other growth opportunities, I think as families age and people become more prone to litigate over wealth, I think there will be growth in those areas. We saw it with one of the larger cow-based families not so long ago, that there was a major dispute, most of which involved the shareholdings in a BVI company. And I think that as Alan says, BVI has been used for a lot of those wealth structures. Lots of the beneficial owners are aging and as disputes become more common, I think there will be a growth in that, an unfortunate growth in some ways, but a growth in that level of litigation.
I agree, and I think that the number of BVI companies out there holding wealth for families who are aging, who are needing to do some kind of succession planning is really a sort of embedded value in the BVI company base, because there is going to have to be some action taken in respect of all of those companies, whether it's forming a Vista Trust or some other kind of structure to deal with the orderly succession of those shares. And as I mentioned before, I think this is the great sort of elephant in the room to some extent for BVI companies with such a large accumulated base of incorporations, which are going to require some dealing going forward, whether it's a structure or even sort of probate or administration in the BVI. So I think we're going to see a lot of growth there, and private trust companies, family offices are going to be, I think, one of the drivers of that as well.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo the comments around drivers and usage, but perhaps the two comments I'd make would be, firstly, around focus. I think focus is an interesting one in the BVI's case, because I think part of its competitive advantage is the fact that it hasn't focused solely on one solution. Part of its advantage is the fact that it can provide multiple solutions for multiple demand drivers. So I think keeping the sort of broad brush will be important for the BVI, rather than trying to sort of focus down too much. The point one. The second point is, you kind of mentioned the question around a disruptor. So we often sort of, over a beer think, what's the Uber of the industry? How could this industry be disrupted? And I don't know the answer, but I think one of the things that the BVI will need to think about is how do they better leverage and utilise technology. If you go back to, sort of particularly from an Asia context, speed, efficiency, turnaround time, all of these things will become more important moving forward. So how does the jurisdiction, invest in, as I say, leverage technology in a way that perhaps it isn't at the moment? So if I had the answer, I'd tell you, but I just
Set it up.
Thank you. Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd echo there is that close relationship between the private client world and the business world that we see here, and the way that BVI is used for that. We see that becoming probably more institutional business going forward. We certainly see actually BVI used more frequently in some of the very large deals that are done now, without question. It's in there as one of the jurisdictions that's used by the blue chip institutions in this part of the world. I think what's important is, and I go back to that ability to deploy and redeploy capital, international relations and the BVI government maintaining those is absolutely critical. And in Asia, with all the various governments that you have here, and there are opportunities at various times with each of those countries, and it's a question of being smart in terms of the access that the jurisdiction has with each of those governments.
Not an easy thing. Thank you. John?
Yeah, I suppose, not to finish on a pessimistic note, I just think we have to be realistic about the threats. I think that we're an emerging market zone in the world that is benefiting at the macro level from the cash flows and the investment, and BVI is the established means of getting through that transitional emerging market period. But that said, emerging markets are going to emerge to somewhere. Singaporean companies, Singapore government wants to have them used more commonly. Hong Kong's got drives for a funds industry. Seychelles and others are on the move. So I wouldn't like to just forget about the fact that there are a lot of competitive factors at play here. And the momentum is the great strength, but we have to keep investing in and keeping it front of mind that BVI is the one to use, because the competition is real. But I think the BVI has a tremendous head start in a number of areas we talked about today, and I think it's been a very positive and accurate reflection of where we sit. But I'm a realist in the sense that we experience relatively frequently at the coalface that the competition for jurisdictional competition is quite real.
Well, we're out of time. I'd like to thank you very much. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.